My name is Mat Hinds. I'm a fully registered Tasmanian architect and principal of Taylor and Hinds Architects. My practice is internationally regarded. We have twice been nominated for the Royal Academy Dorfman Award and the International Swiss Architectural Prize. My practice was identified by the Italian architectural media recently as one of the world's leading architectural practices in cultural heritage. We have received Australia's most prestigious awards in heritage for our work twice, and this year we've been recognised as Architects of the Year by Vogue. I am here today as I have provided professional support to Bents Mulcahy and Our Place as an objective professional witness to their efforts in exposing the ridiculous proposition for a stadium on the waterfront of this city. There is wide unease in the spheres of spatial practice in Tasmania about the proposition of a stadium, including a majority of my colleagues who are engineers, planners and other architects. But Tasmania being what it is, it takes courage to vocalise a dissenting professional position. It is widely known that the government and the public service have long memory of professional views which do not accord with policy. In part, I have entered this dialogue out of burgeoning frustration for the treatment that I have been witnessing of fellow colleagues whose efforts in exposing the appalling spatial reality of the stadium that have been considered and measured and whose professional actions have been precise and courageous. Next slide, please. Based on the exact dimensions provided in government-sanctioned documentation, the stadium will be, as a fact, the same height or higher than the Grand Chancellor. A design does not need to be completed to appreciate the bulk and height required to facilitate an understanding of this impact. These images tell us categorically that the proposal of a stadium is a mathematical and spatial nonsense on the waterfront of Hobart. Next slide, please. On this precise question, the Premier has directly engaged in a campaign to mislead the people of Tasmania and denigrate the professionalism of this considered position. In seeking to counter the profound reality of the massing studies of the stadium produced by Shamus and his practice, the Premier said, and I quote, "Don't be fooled by the blockers, as dodgy as some of their efforts may be. We're still working on the designs for Mac Point, but here's the real stadium outline from the waterfront. I'm proud to see everyday Tasmania standing up and calling out this nonsense." I agree wholeheartedly with the Premier's last statement. This proposition is a total nonsense. Can you go to the next slide, please? The image furnishing his statement intentionally misrepresents the experiential reality of the mass of the stadium. This image is visualised with far more foreground, which seeks to hide the actual impacts of the stadium's urban impacts and bulk, and by some incomprehensible magic promises to ephemerally float as a phlegm-coloured cloud. Next, please. But if we remove the artifice, the government massing and the comparative massing produced by Our Place perfectly aligns, except that the government massing shows no allowance for any structure to clear span the field. Next, please. As in the law, precedent is an important form of evidence in architectural process. We rely on it to tell us spatial realities about the risks and promises of a proposition. Shamus is absolutely right to rely so heavily on this form of spatial evidence. Next, please. If we take Marvel Stadium, it tells us the following. It was constructed well outside the complex urban structure of a city on a benign site. Marvel relied on an enormous apron of open space for its construction and urban promise, and an equivalent apron is not available at Mac Point. Next, please. Marvel cost $1 billion adjusted for inflation, but was so burdened by the ongoing exorbitant costs of maintaining a green because of the overshadowing of the stadium structure and the unevenness of the ground, that the Victorian government sold the stadium to it and its site freehold to the AFL prior to COVID for less than 1/5 of its construction cost. The construction of a stadium on the Docklands site completely obliterated the market value of the land. Next, please. In a city with 10 times the population of Hobart and with existing public networks infrastructure, the best in the world apparently, in 24 years the Marvel Stadium has realised none of its promise for urban renewal. It is an urban dead zone. Next, please. Macquarie Point, on the other hand, has the broadest civic prospects of any inner urban site in the country, and these civic prospects are unequalled. Characteristically, a stadium is an internally focused structure. Its spatial purpose is to focus toward the centre rather than outward toward the periphery. By that spatial definition, a blind, massive amphitheatre is not typologically suited to a site with broad civic and landscape aspects, and certainly not to the only inner city site of its kind in the country. Next, please. The systems of the City of Hobart are not prepared for anything like the infrastructural scale of a stadium. Transport systems and city services circulation will need massive reconfiguration to facilitate the servicing for a stadium of the scale proposed. The Macquarie Point site is curtailed by a high heritage civic and ceremonial setting on reclaimed land with maritime infrastructure to the shoreward side. It is a knuckle of urban intensity where all of these elements coalesce. The proposition of a blind structure on this site is absolutely a question of the city's urban spirit and economic life. Mac Point does not have a sufficient service or urban apron to facilitate a structure of the scale proposed in Hobart. Stadiums are realmic structures. It's not just the object of a stadium. Its service requirements will need to populate adjacent areas such as the Cenotaph Mound and the broader domain. There has been absolutely no intelligent urban framework applied in the government's proposition for a stadium on this site. As Shamus has correctly and precisely highlighted, the site is too small to yield a promised communal and cultural functions, as well as a 40-metre high stadium of the required circumference. The stadium mass overshadows the entire site, and no one wants coffee in the shade and exposed to the southerly sea breeze. On the mooted question of procurement, the government will likely seek to pass AFL-imposed contract delay penalties directly through the Crown contract onto a Tier 1 head contractor, who will likely be from the mainland. This will increase the risk for the head contractor, which will manifest as a higher tender price in a less competitive field, paid for by the Tasmanian people. These economics are unjustifiable and will prejudice the Tasmanian people for generations, a fact already exposed by Jeff Kennett. Applied as liquidated damages and likely in the exponential order of additional millions, these kinds of contract penalties have already been agreed to by the Premier in negotiations with the AFL. The risks are elevated in the current construction market. Construction delay is absolutely certain. The example of this can be drawn towards Victoria's current infrastructure delay costs. It is a major cost risk to pass onto the public purse in Tasmania. Next slide, please. The legacy will be a huge unfenestrated mass on the waterfront of the city, with a cheaply detailed skin plastered in advertisements and AFL branding, and no amount of dressing up will avoid it being lipstick on a pig, built as quickly and cheaply as possible. Next, please. The cenotaph is arguably the most sacred ceremonial axis in the city. Certainly nationally, it is unparalleled in its landscape power and solemn feeling. The cenotaph site was chosen because the mound is prominent and offers the last orientation of homeland sighted by the departing troops as they headed out into Storm Bay by boat to war. It is a ceremonial sightline of unparalleled significance, the oldest in the country. Next, please. The bulk of the proposed stadium promises to terminate the axis of the cenotaph, which is currently a 60-kilometre long vista over South Arm and the Southern Ocean. The mass of the stadium will interrupt this sacred line of sight, which is one of the great ceremonial axes of any city in the country. Next, please. The first post on Anzac Day will be backlit by the lighting of advertisements and the AFL logo. All I have laid before you in support of the clarifying work done by others shows unequivocally that this proposal for a stadium on the waterfront is a proposition of unprecedented spatial devastation and breathtaking absurdity. Thank you.
We'll go straight to questions. I know Simon had someone, Luke.
Thank you. And noting we way over time, we haven't really had too much of a chance to scrutinise any of this, especially that last image with the advertising plastered over a concrete drum. We heard from the Macquarie Point Development Corporation early today, and they were asked about these exact renderings, and they, as conclusively as they possibly could, said it would have been good to perhaps have these conversations. I think they said they'll be getting the designs in a week or two, and to be asking you guys about this then. But it's, from what they've said, it's going to look nothing like this from either a massing perspective or the visual perspective. And I've seen these sort of artistic renderings before, with similar groups to try and, scare or provide some sort of impact. Yeah, apologies. Just in response to Macquarie Point's Development Corporation's statements that it's what that image shows is nothing like what we're going to see. And I know Mr Browne had to leave, but his statements around the project of state significance process, foregoing any of the planning considerations and heritage, in this time I've been looking through the guidelines, it's 40 pages, and apart from the economic impacts and cost benefits, it is requiring the process to consider Aboriginal heritage, wind effects, traffic effects, built form, impact on the local place. I'm just trying to factor this, the built
Question?
form. I'm asking there to factor in the built form and the planning process into what we're actually going to see, because I'm just not sure how this image and what you guys have said aligns with what we're going to actually see as a stadium.
There is nothing about the images that are produced or the alternative that was proposed, that was shown by the Premier. They are precisely the same size. You don't need any of those processes, which are absolutely critical to any formulation of a building or an architectural response. You don't need those processes to start to know that this is a stupid idea to have a building of this kind on that site. There is that statement in and of itself is the beginning. It should have stopped as an idea. It shouldn't have even been uttered. It's a ridiculous notion. So those assessments can take place. The Macquarie Point Corporation can keep talking to you in the way that they will probably seek to position with you as an armature of the government that they need to have a particular line on these things. They're not going to tell you this won't work. And I am not of the view that even the architects who are engaged will tell you that this won't work. I've been in a position where I've been engaged by government. I've told them of a particular project that will not work. I was terminated the next day and another architect was appointed. So that is the kind of atmosphere of engagement that occurs in this context. I'm not interested in... All of those things have to happen, Simon. All of those assessments take place, but the proposition on this site is ludicrous from the beginning.
But if I can also answer, there's two things. The renders shown are not propaganda, they're not illusion. They are a statement of mathematical fact. They are the visual representation of the figures your government has put out as to the dimensions of the stadium.
Prior to any proper planning and design had gone on.
But consistent with precedent, those images adopt the materiality of the Docklands Stadium precisely.
Are they not presented in a way to overemphasise
Simon,
massive ugly? Well, let me ask my question.
That's what's scary about it.
Let me ask my question. You've got a grey, solid massing with, as you've said, additional articulations on top. Is it not designed visually to look as impactful as humanly possible?
In fact, it'll look a lot worse from many other places in the city. But I think Shamus wants to say something.
Shamus?
Oh, look, I think you're doing quite well, guys. It's a simple fact. You cannot cloak the scale and the mass of a building like that with minor detail. It's that big, and that's kind of it.
I'd make a further point. The designs that will be presented in a week or two's time will try and gussy the pig up. And what will happen when the inevitable cost blowouts happen and your government panics because people start getting very, very angry as to what happened. And you know how angry they are because you saw the results in the election with the complete collapse of your vote up north. And what they'll do then is they will panic, and those bureaucrats had here this morning will be cutting all those gussing effects off, and we'll go back to the very worst
So can I ask perhaps if your group would be happy to comment on the concept plans when they're available and provide feedback to the committee on your take on it?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course we would.
Because then we're looking at what they're actually putting forward to the POS.
Rather than speculative.
Yes, that's right.
Well, it's not speculative. You've gone out and sold this. You've actually made a deal. You've signed a blank cheque that we have to pay for that stadium. You know, before you had designs, before you knew you couldn't even get buses in there, before you knew that it was going to overshadow the cenotaph, before you knew that the $240 million you had to pay out of the GST. You did all those things before you knew what the consequences of this appallingly stupid decision by your leader was. This is so destructive of our future. And I'm here for one reason. I am ashamed. I'm ashamed to walk past the homeless people every day in this city, the numbers of which grow. I was up in the Domain this morning. There are people in wet sleeping bags there. There are people in collapsing tents. I am ashamed. I'm ashamed to be a Booker Prize winner in an island that's got a 50% illiteracy rate. I am ashamed. I'm ashamed to every day meet people with stories of the worsening and the worst health system in the country. I am ashamed because your government has only one priority and one policy, and it is to waste billions of dollars on this utter folly because your Premier was seduced by the executive of a large entertainment corporation who came into this island and made that demand.
Okay, we might. Our committee's role is to assess the financial impact. You've made some comments around that, but we do need to wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.